welcome to another deep dive. This was going to be about something I find really fascinating, Reconstruction. It's that time after the Civil War when, well, the U.S. was trying to figure out how to put itself back together.
Yeah, it's kind of a crucial but often overlooked period.
For sure. And we've got a great resource to guide. It's a chapter from The Unfinished Nation. Good for facts, but we're going to bring those facts to life, right? Like, what did freedom even mean to folks in the South after the war?
That's the really juicy part. Freedom was a very different concept depending on who you were. You had formerly enslaved people, obviously white Southerners who'd been in power, and even poor whites who didn't benefit much from slavery, but still.
Right, still went along with the whole system.
Yeah.
Okay, so formerly enslaved people, after generations of being denied basic rights, what did freedom represent for them?
For them, freedom wasn't just about not being enslaved anymore. It was about finally getting basic human rights, the right to vote, to hold office. And then there was this huge desire for economic independence.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Like, they wanted to actually control their own lives, not just be free, but still stuck in poverty.
Exactly. Land ownership was huge EE. Fair wages, being able to work for themselves. They wanted a real stake in this society they were now a part of.
And the chapter quotes this former slave, Margaret Nellen. Her words are so powerful. She talks about how in slavery, she owned nothing and never would, but in freedom, she had this home, a family to raise. And with that came worries she never had before.
It's such a good point. Freedom wasn't just this, joyous celebration. It brought huge challenges, this heavy weight of responsibility.
Makes you think about it from their perspective. Now, got to talk about the other side. White Southerners. What did they think freedom looked like after the war?
Well, especially the planter class, the ones who'd benefited most from slavery. For a lot of them, freedom meant clinging to as much of their pre-war life as possible.
Yeah, minimal interference from the government, I bet.
Oh, yeah. They wanted control over labor to keep that social hierarchy intact. Basically, they didn't want things to change too much.
The book has this quote from Frances Butler Lee, a planter's daughter in Georgia. She's complaining that the formerly enslaved workers are willful and won't work unless they feel like it. She even says she misses the old slavery times, because at least then she knew what to expect.
It shows you just how deeply ingrained those power dynamics were. Their vision of freedom was fundamentally at odds with what the formerly enslaved people were striving for.
Total clash of expectations.
Yeah.
But what about poor white Southerners? They didn't own plantations, but many still fought for the Confederacy. Where did they fit into all this?
So for a lot of them, the war's end actually meant opportunity. With the planter class weakened, they saw a chance to maybe climb that social ladder. But their version of freedom often still included this idea of white supremacy. They saw black people as competition for land, for jobs.
So even though they didn't benefit from slavery in the same way as the planters, they still...
Right. They still wanted to maintain a system where they were, at the very least, above black people in the social order.
Wow, so we've got at least three very different ideas of freedom all colliding in this one moment in history. No wonder things got messy. And politically, I bet there were some major clashes too, right?
Absolutely. Even within the North, there was a lot of disagreement on how to handle those former Confederate states. Take Lincoln's 10% plan, for example.
Yeah. Wasn't that pretty lenient?
It was. Basically, only 10% of a state's population had to pledge loyalty to the U.S., and boom, they were back in the Union. Plus, Lincoln offered amnesty to most Confederates.
Sounds kind of easy given what had just happened.
Lincoln's focus was on healing the nation quickly. But this made a lot of people angry. They felt like the South should face harsher consequences for the war and that the formerly enslaved people needed more protection.
That's where the radical Republicans come in, right? Weren't they pushing for something much stricter?
Yeah, they were. Guys like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, they wanted a majority oath, not just 10%. And they wanted to ban former Confederates from voting, holding office. Basically, they wanted to reshape Southern society from the ground up.
Wow, that's a bold move. So did their plan ever actually happen?
Well, it passed both houses of Congress, but Lincoln vetoed it. He felt it was too harsh and would make it almost impossible for the North and South to reconcile.
Makes sense. He was all about unity. But then, of course...
Of course, Lincoln's assassinated, and who takes over? Andrew Johnson, a Southerner. And not just any Southerner, one with deeply racist views.
Talk about a game changer.
Oh.
Okay, so Johnson's in charge now, and I have a feeling things are about to get even more complicated. So Andrew Johnson, huh? A Southerner with, shall we say, complicated views on race, now in charge of Reconstruction. I can't imagine this went over well with the radical Republicans.
Oh, they were furious. To them, Johnson basically threw all their ideals about equality right out the window. He saw Reconstruction as a chance to restore the old Southern order, just without the legal framework of slavery.
And he wasn't shy about his feelings either. The chapter quotes him saying, "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men." I mean, yikes.
Yeah, pretty blatant, right? And his policies were in line with those views. He started handing out pardons to former Confederates left and right, and basically gave white Southerners free rein to rebuild their governments with minimal interference.
So basically, everything the radical Republicans had fought against. But what about the newly freed black people? Were they just left to fend for themselves?
Well, that's where things get really ugly. Southern states started passing these laws called black codes. Basically, they were trying to recreate slavery in everything but name.
Seriously, how was that even possible after the war had been fought and slavery was abolished?
It was a sneaky way to get around the 13th Amendment. The codes imposed all these restrictions on black people's lives. Curfews, limitations on what jobs they could hold, even making it illegal for them to gather without white supervision.
It's sickening. Like they risked their lives fighting for freedom and then they're hit with this.
It was a deliberate attempt to keep them in a state of economic and social dependence. The idea was to force them back into labor arrangements that were pretty much indistinguishable from slavery.
So what did the radical Republicans do about this? They couldn't just sit back and watch this happen, right?
Oh, they were ready to fight. They saw Johnson's actions as a total betrayal. And to them, it was proof that the South couldn't be trusted to rebuild itself fairly. So they decided to take matters into their own hands.
Okay, so what do?
They basically staged a congressional takeover of Reconstruction. In 1867, they passed the Reconstruction Act, and they did it over Johnson's veto. This act was huge GE. It divided the South into military districts and required states to ratify the 14th Amendment to be readmitted to the Union.
Wait, the 14th Amendment. Remind me what that was about again.
It was a major game changer. It granted citizenship to everyone born in the U.S., including formerly enslaved people, and guaranteed equal protection under the law. It was a direct challenge to the black codes and all those attempts to relegate black people to second-class status.
So it sounds like this is when radical Reconstruction really got going.
Yeah.
Things must have started to change, right?
For a while, yeah. With federal troops backing them up, black Southerners started to exercise their newfound rights. They registered to vote, ran for office, and even won. We're talking over 2,000 black men elected to office during this period.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
It must have felt like real progress was being made.
Absolutely. You had black men serving in state legislatures, as judges, even in Congress. Hiram Revels, for example, became the first black senator in U.S. history. It was a pretty remarkable moment.
But I have a feeling this wasn't going to last forever. There had to be pushback from white Southerners, right?
Oh, yeah. The resistance was fierce. They weren't about to give up their power that easily. We're talking violence, intimidation, economic pressure, you name it.
I bet a Ku Klux Klan was involved.
They were, for sure. But they weren't the only ones. All sorts of groups popped up with the goal of terrorizing black communities and anyone who supported them. They wanted to make it clear that black people stepping out of line would have dire consequences.
So how did black people even survive in this environment? It must have been terrifying.
It was. But they were resilient. They formed their own self-defense groups, they relied on their communities for support, and they kept pushing for change despite the risks. But the truth is, the odds were stacked against them.
And it sounds like the North's commitment to Reconstruction was starting to waver too, right?
Yeah, as time went on, the political will to keep pushing for racial equality in the South started to fade. There were scandals, economic problems, and a lot of people just wanted to move on from the whole messy business of Reconstruction.
Plus, the chapter mentions some Supreme Court decisions that didn't help matters.
Right. The slaughterhouse cases in 1873 really weakened the 14th Amendment's power to protect civil rights. Basically, the court ruled that the amendment only applied to federal actions, not to discrimination by individuals or states.
So it was a big setback for Reconstruction.
Definitely. It signaled that the federal government wasn't going to be able to shield black Southerners from discrimination as effectively as they had hoped.
And then, of course, there's the Compromise of 1877. That seemed to mark the end of Reconstruction, didn't it?
It did. It was basically a backroom deal struck during the disputed presidential election of 1876. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South in exchange for getting the presidency. And with that, Reconstruction was effectively over.
Wow, just abandoned like that. So what happened next?
Well, that's a story for another time. But let's just say that the end of Reconstruction led to a long and dark period for black Southerners.
So Reconstruction's over, Federal troops are gone, and black Southerners are basically on their own. What happened next? I mean, did Reconstruction accomplish anything in the end, or was it all for nothing?
Well, it's definitely complicated. I mean, it obviously failed to achieve its ultimate goal of true racial equality in the South,
Yeah.
right? But to say it accomplished nothing would be wrong, too. It left behind a pretty complex legacy, one that still shapes America in a lot of ways today.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about that legacy. The chapter talks about this thing called the lost cause narrative. What was that all about?
Right, so the Lost Cause, it was basically a myth, a way for white Southerners to rewrite history and romanticize the Confederacy, downplaying slavery, portraying themselves as victims, and turning Confederate leaders into heroes.
So basically trying to make the South look good, even though they, lost the war and fought to preserve slavery.
Exactly. It was a way to justify their actions, shift blame away from themselves, and basically pretend that the whole thing wasn't about slavery in the first place.
And this lost cause idea, it wasn't just some fringe theory, right?
Nope. It became incredibly influential. It shaped how generations of Americans understood the Civil War and Reconstruction, especially in the South.
Did that even happen?
Well, they were pretty strategic about it. They controlled the narrative, basically. Textbooks, monuments, literature, even popular films. They all pushed this romanticized version of the Confederacy.
The chapter mentions The Birth of a Nation, that movie from 1915. Wasn't that pretty controversial?
Yeah, that's one example. It actually glorified the Ku Klux Klan, portrayed them as heroes protecting white Southerners from, the savagery of black people. It's really disturbing to watch today, but back then it was a huge hit.
Wow. So this lost cause narrative really took hold, huh?
It did, and it had some pretty lasting consequences. It helped to justify the Jim Crow system that emerged after Reconstruction, all those laws that enforced segregation and disenfranchisement of black people. It basically reinforced the idea that white supremacy was the natural order of things.
So yeah, that's a pretty dark legacy. But what about the other side of the coin? Were there any positive outcomes from Reconstruction, despite everything that went wrong?
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's easy to focus on the failures, right? But we can't forget about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Those were huge victories.
Right, the Reconstruction Amendments.
Yeah.
But weren't they basically ignored for decades after Reconstruction ended?
Well, yeah, they were definitely undermined and weakened by the South. But the point is, they were there. They became part of the Constitution. And that meant they could be used later on as a legal basis for fighting for civil rights.
Ah, so even though they weren't fully enforced at the time, they laid the groundwork for future progress.
Exactly. They provided a foundation for the civil rights movement of the 20th century. All those battles against segregation, for voting rights, for equal protection under the law, those were all building on the promises made during Reconstruction.
So in a way, the fight for racial equality that started during Reconstruction, it never really ended, did it?
It didn't. It just went through different phases, different strategies. But the core issues, the struggle for justice and equality, those are still with us today.
Wow. That's a pretty powerful thought.
It is. And I think it's something important for all of us to remember.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored the complexities of Reconstruction, the hopes, the failures, the battles, and the legacies that continue to shape America even today.
And hopefully we've left you with a better understanding of just how pivotal this period was in American history. And maybe even some things to think about in terms of where we are now as a nation.
Yeah, for sure. And if anyone out there wants to learn more, well, you know what to do. Hit the books, dive into some documentaries. There's a ton of great information out there.
Definitely. Don't let this be the end of your exploration. Keep learning, keep questioning, keep pushing for a better understanding of history.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Until next time.